Eric Kaufmann, welcome to Conversations with Peter Boghossian. I'm going to jump right into it, and then I'll read. I realized, shit, I'm on the wrong network. Should I go back, Reed? Sorry, Eric. I hope I don't lose you. Hold on one second. I'm trying to change networks. Eric, can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry about that. Okay, you're a professor of politics, University of Buckingham, and the author of The Third Awokening, and a friend of the show. How are you?
I'm great. We've finally got some sun here in London, which has been a long time coming this summer.
Well, good for you. This is way beyond when I normally wake up. It's the only time I can figure it, and I'm just so tired right now. Okay, so what was the response to? Let's just jump right into it. What was the response to the attempted assassination attempt? What did your peers, your colleagues, what are the people saying over there on the island?
Well, I think there is it's interesting. I don't know what the response is like in the U.S., but I think it's probably fairly similar here. There's kind of a certain amount of shock that you could have such a close call with such an important individual. You obviously have that anti-Trump sentiment amongst a certain segment of the population that cares about politics, but I don't think there were a lot of people saying, "Oh, I really hope that the bullet got him." You know what I mean?
Wow,
Yeah. How about over there? What's your impression?
Oh my God, that's okay. I'm going to pause on that because I think that there were definitely a small segment, but a segment of people who were really disheartened that he wasn't murdered.
I've got some survey evidence for you on that, which I haven't released yet, but I can talk about. It's interesting.
Really? Can you talk about? Can you talk about it or no?
Yeah, why not? I mean, I just decided to run a little snap poll on one of the survey platforms. So it looks like about 30% of Democrats sort of agree with the statement, "Too bad that he missed." So that's about where now what you find is, if you break it down, the Democrats who agree with the statement, white Republicans are racist, it's about 40%, and those who disagree with that, it's below 10%. So there's some sort of a link there between this moral absolutism, and I talk about that in the book. Yeah.
Okay, before we talk about, let's go about that. So what's the methodology? How's that data collected?
For the simple fourth choice question, I'm trying to remember the exact wording. It's too bad that the shooter missed Trump.
Yeah, but the data collection, is it like, obviously they're self-selected, it's an online platform, run me through that real quick.
Yeah, so it's prolific academics, used by thousands of academics. It's a standard, probably I'd say the leading platform for academic quantitative research, more so than say Amazon MTurk, which is less reliable.
Right.
And yeah, you basically get people who sign up, do all kinds of surveys, marketing surveys, academic surveys. Whoever happens to get there first answers the question. I use it all the time. It's a great platform and pretty standard, used by academics.
Boy, that's just that 30% of Democrats said it's too bad.
I should say one thing. Sorry, this is not necessarily a representative sample. That number could be higher, could be lower. It's very difficult to know.
And who are and again, I'm asking you these questions mostly, because I'm interested, but just for listeners, whenever you hear stuff like this, you have to look at the methods. You have to figure out how people know those things. It's so your first questions you should always ask someone when they give you data. Okay, so are they primarily academics, or who's answering these questions?
No, this would just be ordinary members of the public who get paid to do surveys of all kinds. So it's a survey platform.
That's just, I don't know if that's that's just so disheartening. I don't know if that's end of empire stuff or it's just like some other kind of malady or sickness or what. I mean, that's okay. Well, I'll hold on, waxing off of that. Okay, so I have really something in the back of my mind that I want to talk to you about. That you said to me in our last interview that I've almost literally thought about every day since that interview. And then I looked into it too. You told me, and you were correct in this, that when you look at, and correct me if I'm wrong in any part of this, okay? You told me that there's overwhelming data now about who contributes to the Treasury and who takes away from the Treasury.
Did I tell you that? I mean, there is certainly data on immigration in Europe. Yes. So that there is academic.
Yeah, that'd be funny if you didn't tell me any of this, but I just been thinking about something that I pulled out of my ear. It's something that doesn't have anything to do with anything, and I've been like thinking about this. But one of the things you said, like who contributes to the NHS, who are net contributors, and then I looked up the data for that, and I think again, please correct me if I'm wrong. Like Somalis are not. Somalis are at the top of the list for net. What would the word be? People who take from the Treasury. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, I actually haven't seen the UK data on this because they actually don't collect. In fact, the UK does not collect the data, and that's, I think, perhaps a deliberate thing. But they refuse to provide this kind of data for immigration by country of origin. There was a study in the Netherlands by an academic which was really comprehensive. Jan van de Beek. And
I saw that I looked at, yeah.
Yeah, and I would be amazed if the numbers look that different in Britain. And so it's really about immigration from, Middle East, North Africa, or Africa. It depends, but I think on average, certainly in continental Europe, it's a net negative on the Treasury if you take away contributions in tax minus public services used. Then you come up with a negative number.
Okay, so this is incredibly interesting to me. So that is how I remembered it correctly. I think I did not articulate that because I'm tired, and I apologize for that. Okay, so subsequent to that, I looked at the data, as much data as I could find, because I found that to be fascinating, because I wanted to see if there are any emerging themes in different groups and different people. And again, I'm not an expert in this, but from my little more than cursory reading on the subject, I saw that there were consistent patterns that emerged for who takes away from the Treasury and who contributes to the Treasury.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, because you have to factor in things like use of roads and all kinds of public services, even things you wouldn't ordinarily think of, not just welfare payments, but also use of services in general, apply a cost, and then look at contributions to the Treasury in various ways.
Okay, so we're in agreement on that. And again, I don't really like to speak outside my area, but from what I have seen, I'm even hesitant to say this, but I'm going to say it because it does seem to comport with just what the data is. From what I have seen, there's one group that is almost always at the top or in the top two for groups that take away from the Treasury, and that is Somalis. That's correct. Yeah, that's Somalis.
Yeah, I mean, I have no reason to think otherwise, but I think Van de Beek's data, I think, sort of back that up. Whether they are much different than Afghans or very, other Eritreans or other, it's not clear. But I think whether you can parse it out that finely to single groups, perhaps he did, yeah.
Okay, so here's my question to you. And I've one of the reasons that I'm saying this is because I see a lot of hate against Sikhs, and I don't really understand it. I find it baffling because I looked at the data for that, and they seem to be among the most law-abiding of any group that comes of immigrants. And if you're uncomfortable answering this question, you don't have to answer it.
Okay.
Wouldn't it be rational for a country to make an immigration policy centered around who contributes and who takes from the treasury?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that certainly makes sense if it's, if immigration is supposed to be in the interest of a country. Now, if they're uncomfortable, there's this whole question about how you distinguish who to let into your country. Is it racial discrimination if you discriminate on the basis of culture? Now, my view on that is actually that admitting immigrants into your country is a bit like admitting members into a club, where you actually are permitted to discriminate in terms of free association and membership. And there's an academic paper on this by a guy called Chris Wellman in a leading political theory journal, which kind of makes this case that nations are, they have free choice. They're like private associations or actors that can choose to, for example, join an association like the European Union, leave the European Union, and likewise, they can make rules for membership. And that's perfectly in keeping with liberalism, actually. It's not the same thing as within a country. If you discriminate against your own citizens on the basis of culture or ethnicity, then that is clearly a violation of equal treatment. But when you're dealing with the rest of the world, it's like if you are an Italian club, you can discriminate in favor of Italians, or if you're a Catholic church, you can discriminate in favor of Catholics. If it's part of germane to who you are and what you want to be, and because you're dealing with, you can select, you have free agency and free association. It's not the same relationship. So the Catholic Church's relationship to the population is not the same as a bank's or a hotel.
Correct.
The bank cannot discriminate against non-Catholics. The Catholic Church can. And that's sort of the same with nations. They can discriminate with regard to who they pick to be a member with the rest of the world. They don't owe the same duties of non-discrimination that they owe to their own citizens. So yeah, I think that's an important point that is often, it's simply not addressed, or it's elided, so that any form of cultural selection is seen as somehow equal to, not treating blacks and whites the same in hiring at a bank or something. And it's just a separate principle.
I completely agree. And now I'd like you to please explain to me why. Oh, and there's the paper. Thanks, Reed. Immigration and Freedom of Association.
Well done.
Yeah. Okay. So now please explain to me why this heuristic, or this, I don't know what you'd want to call it, isn't being used to determine who should come into certain countries who want immigrants to come in. Like, I would think that would be the first order of business. And then if anybody accuses you of racism, you would just present the data. I'm harboring no acts against Somalis, just as the data, they're net detractors from the treasury. But here, these people are net contributors to the treasury, and they're more than welcome to come in. Now, maybe you would want to say that there are special, is it H1B, those visas that you give for special talent. After the war in Ukraine, by the way, immediately afterward, I said that we should brain drain Russia and just give hundreds of thousands of those visas and take their intellectuals and their scientists. But why isn't anybody talking about that in Europe? Or if they are, I've certainly not heard of it. That should be the criterion for an immigration policy.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you've got really two approaches. One, you could just say, I'm going to use a set of really fine-grained metrics that will pick out the economic contributors from the non-contributors. Is it the case, if you looked at education and earnings in the home country, you wouldn't have to use an area-based classification? Because part of this is maybe about poor education or poverty or some other predictor, which might be independent of country of origin. So I guess in theory, if you had a very stringent but kind of country blind criteria, you might be able to sort of deal with this problem. I mean, there's a separate issue, which is really that of if you're concerned about culture and ethnic makeup of your country, then you can't get away from cultural forms of selection. In theory, I suppose if your only concern is contribution to the treasury, you could just go for net worth and education, and it would just result in people from certain countries being less likely perhaps to get in. I think a lot of what's happening in Europe is you've had a lot of refugees a lot of family reunification, and a lot of people overstaying visas. And this is where you're getting, I think, perhaps a sort of lower quality person kind of coming in and who isn't going to contribute as much. So I guess you can probably take it either way. You could either get very stringent on your financial criteria and education, or you go for a kind of some kind of cultural selection criteria.
I mean, okay, I'm not sure what else you would do. I just never hear anybody talking about that. And if is the claim that it's collective punishment and then all immigration should be case by case, if that's the claim, I just don't think that the system is capable of making those discerning judgments. I think it's just far easier to say, listen, here's the data, and if you're from here, you're not coming in, and if you're from here, you're welcome in. And I know that must seem, I don't know, I don't really give a shit at this point if people are like, because I just think that the whole society is like, I'm watching the whole thing crumble.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you put your finger, I mean, really what's behind this, of course, is the anti-racism taboo, which is kind
Correct.
of at the core of my book, The Third Awokening. I'm arguing this is the kind of big bang of our moral order. The center of our moral universe is the anti-racism taboo, which springs up in the mid-60s in the US and now sort of pervades all these policy areas, whether it's crime, incarceration, excluding pupils from class for bad behavior, or immigration policy. All of these things are kind of taboos and out of bounds because they're associated. You could say, well, immigrants are more likely to be non-white than natives, and therefore any restriction on immigration is ipso facto racist. I mean, it's ridiculous, but there is an ability to toxify all these policy domains. Now, of course, what that's meant is the mainstream has shied away. The populist right has moved in because they're the only ones willing to have these conversations. As they get up to, 15, 20, 25, and in the case of Austria and France in the 40s, then suddenly the, mainstream right starts to talk about immigration restriction. We've just had an election here in Britain where Boris Johnson pretended to be a populist on immigration, but really wasn't one.
Right.
He stole the he managed to sort of get the Brexit vote. The Tories then ramped up immigration. The voters then are punishing them now, and their Reform, which is Nigel Farage's party, has got in on 14%, cost the Tories hundreds, perhaps, of seats. But that's an example, right? So what happens when the mainstream right follows the populist right and starts talking about immigration? It starts to erode the taboo a certain degree, push it back, open what we call the Overton window of acceptable debate. But then, of course, there's always an attempt by the media and progressives to close that again and to make it toxic again. I think we're probably having a more open conversation now than we might have had 10, 15 years ago, but it's still very fought over, and there's still an attempt to try and shut it down in mainstream discourse.
Is the fundamental assumption there? It seems like that there are embedded presuppositions in those arguments. For example, it seems that it's just a cultural explanation for these phenomena. Like, it's just who contributes and who takes away from the treasury can be explained culturally, but the people who participate in that culture have certain, shall we say, racial characteristics. So discriminating against them on the basis of that would be a proxy for discriminating against them on the basis of race.
Well, I mean, you mean if you put in very stringent net worth criteria and education criteria and you screened most of them out?
I mean, no matter what anybody says, in other words, they're always going to say that's just a proxy for race.
Yeah, I mean, the people who want to essentially stretch that race taboo to cover all kinds of things to shut down democracy around those issues, yeah, they're going to obviously use that tool. It's disingenuous. It doesn't fit. Now, of course, I mean, I actually think a country could get away with a really stringent net worth and education set of criteria that would, it would really narrow who could come into the country. Although I still think because these countries are so poor, you would simply get a brain drain of the very upper crust of these countries. So actually, I still think you would have a tilt towards the global South and probably Middle East, North Africa, or Middle East and Africa. It's just that you would be creaming off the very top tiers. And this is assuming you shut down your asylum and visa programs, family reunification, ability to bring dependents, all of which were, at least in Britain, they expanded it. So if you were a student, you could bring a dependent into Britain. I mean, that led to a huge surge. And of course, that means people who are not going to be skilled and will be a drain on the system. That those loopholes can be closed. I think without, there will be, the far left will attack it as racist, but I think you probably would get away with it in a way that if you went for cultural criteria, I mean, if you look at Trump's Muslim ban, for example, I mean, the outcry will just be much stronger if it can be directly linked to ethnicity and culture.
I think my concern with anything like a Muslim ban, there are multiple concerns there, but one of the concerns I have is that it would make the Muslims who live in the country feel alienated from the country and like they're not participating. And there is a point in population, there's a critical threshold in which you just simply can't do that anymore. It's so obvious to me that you're way past that point in London. And so that's why I think that those, and there also have been calls to deport people who are there legally, which I think is completely insane, which would also alienate people from the country. You talk about this in your book, The Third Awokening. You talk about some solutions. What do you see as the solutions to the immigration problem, among other things?
Well, I think that to the extent that our discourse is narrowed, the Overton window of acceptable debate to the extent that is narrow, the topic of immigration is taken off the table of democratic discussion and political contestation. There's a consensus. Everyone has to abide by it. That consensus has broken down to some degree in different places, and it's held up in other places. We're seeing revolts against it across the Western world, sometimes in the form of a populist movement, other times, as in Ireland, in terms of street movements. I do think we need to have a debate over the pace of cultural change. We need to have an open debate about the speed. Some want it slower, some want it faster. The way the cultural left, and I talk about this in my book, the way the cultural left frames this is you're either an open person or a closed person. If you're an open person, you never want less immigration. Only a closed person would want that, which is sort of kind of the same as a racist. And so this very black and white, totalizing binary worldview is the way that the cultural left looks at a lot of these kinds of issues on the cultural side. So what we actually need, I mean, I talk in the book is really about the rise of woke and its manifestation in our politics. So what I argue is that, in fact, the culture war is not just about culture. That actually the culture war involves a lot of non-economic things. So if you have, very weak patriotism and a very anti-police attitude because of woke, accusing everybody of being racist, you won't be able to recruit a military or a police force.
Yeah, we see that in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah. And if you, for example, if you have a very strong, and what woke is, I define as the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups.
That's a good definition. It's probably better. That's a really good definition.
So the fixation and the sacredness around race means you all of a sudden can't deport people. You can't build a wall. You can't secure your border, because then you can be accused of being racist, and that is a violation of taboo. And what John McWhorter says is social death. So you don't want to kind of commit social death. Therefore, you don't want to touch immigration or deport anybody. Now, clearly, the taboo is much stronger within the Democratic Party in the U.S., let's say. But in a lot of Western countries, Canada would be an example of that. They've got a ridiculous level of immigration. Even the Conservative Party has been really scared to talk about what they would do when they get in. So this whole toxicity around race, which stems from that original anti-racism taboo. One of my points is, in fact, that the Great Awokening in the 2010s, actually, this is only the most recent manifestation of this culture, which goes back to the mid-60s. So, you had a very strong anti-racism taboo around discussing immigration in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. I mean, it wasn't quite as powerful at that time, but it was still there, and I remember it very well. You couldn't really say we need to slow down immigration. We need to slow down cultural change. That was outside the Overton window even then. And so I would argue that the awakening is not new. It's just continuation and a deepening and an acceleration of that post mid-60s culture, which is really sacralizing race, and then later with feminism sacralizing sex, and then the gay movement, homophobia, transphobia, all of this comes out of the making sacred of these particular groups and their movements. And essentially, you want to be an ally. You don't want to be one of these toxic reactionary white males who is responsible for, Jim Crow or Nazism or, and so that is sort of where we are. And so the argument is that people who say, oh, woke is fading away and it's past its peak. It is past its peak for now. But people who say that, I think, have no real perspective on where our culture has gone since the mid-60s, which is very focused on these identity totems.
Okay, so I want to talk about something that literally is the one topic that nobody is allowed to talk about ever.
Okay.
And that it's the race and IQ conversation. Isn't that entire, and I'm not going to give a position on this, but isn't that entire argument predicated on the idea that there are no racial differences in intelligence?
It is, and I guess, but I think, not even if you take away the genetics and the race thing, I mean, whether that is true or not, we're eventually going to know once they do the polygenic studies, because there are hundreds of genes that are affecting intelligence. It'll either be true or it won't be true. But even talking about culture, the idea of saving and hard work, studying, the idea that they vary by culture, not just over group to group, but also over time. So maybe Black Americans had more of an intact family in 1920, 1930 than they do in 1990, 2010. That's going to have an impact. And so an unwillingness to open up the culture question, the only explanation permitted for any discrepancy is structural discrimination. So
systems.
Yeah.
Thomas Sowell talks about that before welfare, black families, etc. And the idea that you can't talk about genetics. Oh, and I have a prediction to you. I'm a big fan making predictions. I predict that all those studies will be illegal. All those studies will be, at some point, they won't allow anything to come out. And the reason they won't allow it is because if they don't allow it, that means that they found genetic differences. And if they do allow it, that it's because they found that there are not. So I have always been, and I've spoken and written about this, I've always been utterly baffled by why the cultural explanation is not allowed into the discourse, because it would seem like you'd want to push the cultural explanation, because if you push the cultural explanation, that means you can demean the genetic explanation, unless you want to make the claim that it's the genetics that causes the culture, but that's clearly false.
Well, I mean, the sacredness around race essentially has allowed progressives to shut down not only, obviously, the genetic conversation, but the cultural one too, because they control that turf so strictly and police the ideas and speech around that issue. They have decided to draw the circle really tightly, so you can't even touch culture. But you're right. The obvious, if you're concerned about convergence between black and white in terms of wealth and education and these other things, surely it should be the case that you would at least want to give this a try. Like, what would happen if, Black America returned to the mindset of the 1940s, when they dressed neatly and clean neighborhoods and low crime and all this stuff and intact families? Like, wouldn't that be an interesting thing to try, to see if that has an impact, which all of the surveys would suggest that it does?
Yeah.
But no, the fact that they're just going to bury their heads in the sand and say it's all, economic change and discrimination is the only allowable explanation. It looks so pathetic to anybody, who isn't a paid up member. I mean, it almost looks like they've got something to hide. And so, yeah, it's bizarre. Of course, a lot of the Black conservative and classical liberal
I was just
types.
thinking of Glenn Lowry. Yeah, I
Yeah,
read his book. Is excellent. His new book's excellent. So he makes that argument, those cultural arguments, and he is an amazing human, super smart guy, and he is it's interesting. He classifies himself as a conservative. Yeah, late admissions. It's great. It's a like a story told in narrative form. It's fantastic. Can't recommend it highly enough. He's very honest in that book too about his past. Do you consider yourself a conservative or liberal, or do you think that those terms, like I think those terms, have virtually no meaning anymore?
well, I do consider myself I mean, it's tricky because I support what I would call procedural liberalism or negative liberalism, which is this idea of you have a sphere of rights, and you can't be arbitrarily arrested. You've got free speech rights, freedom of association rights. So I'm very much I buy into that classical liberal project, uh, but I don't buy into the modern liberalism on culture. Modern liberalism, which is the 20th century version of liberalism, which is incorporated a lot of left-wing ideas. Now, in economics, I have no problem with a mixed capitalist setup. So it's not just pure free market, it's got some welfare state. But on the cultural side, one of the points I make in the book is that left liberalism has no guardrails to its left. So it just says we need more
Right.
diversity, more equity, and we need to be more sensitive, i.e., we need to be more inclusive. Now, they don't say we need a quota for everything, but they're more or less implying the same thing by saying we
Right.
need more, always more, never a boundary. Okay, so if the share reaches this amount, we'll be satisfied. No, it's always
Exactly.
got to be greater and greater. So they may claim they're different from the cultural Marxist Ibram X. Kendi types, but really they're not. They're of a piece, I would argue. And so, yeah, that modern liberalism I find is really behind the Great Awakening. It is sort of what incubates the Great Awakening. This idea of that mix of being super nice and sensitive to people who are the downtrodden, which is the humanitarian element, feeding through psychology to become this kind of, uh, you know, very snowflake-oriented victimhood culture. And then you've also got the affirmative action, equal outcome equity culture, where any race
Right.
gap, gender gap has to be closed to zero. And so that's where we are. I mean, this is really out of left liberalism. So I reject that, but I accept the classical liberal negative liberalism. And I suppose the distinction, which is between what Isaiah Berlin called positive liberty and negative liberty. So the
Yeah.
positive liberty would be you must have pronouns in your bio, or you must celebrate diversity. Those would be an example of positive liberalism, ideals which are pushed by a society and can be very coercive, as opposed to you should tolerate diversity. People, if they want, can put pronouns in their email signature. That's a sort of negative liberty. So you have the right to do it, but just don't hold it up as an ideal, which is then things that everybody else has to conform to, which is really where liberalism has gone. So I think we need to roll that back. And I am a conservative on certain things. I mean, you talk about national cultures and cohesion. I don't believe in the kind of rapid cultural change we've been experiencing. And I also think, you need to move to a position where intact families are the norm. I mean, of course, there will always be people who divorce, and there will always be single mothers, and that has to be tolerated. But there should also be a norm in the society. So I think to that extent, I would be conservative, but I wouldn't be, I'm not a religious conservative, for example, or somebody who believes that things should always be done the same way because they've always been done that way. I mean, I think you can always look at things with data, with evidence, and maybe if it's not the right policy, you can experiment with a new policy. So in that sense, I'm not a true kind of dyed in the wool, old style Burkean,
So you give some fascinating pronouncements about how to get out of this mess. And you've spoken about this. And when Reed and I go around the world, and we're traveling, I think 9 months this year, Oh, and we meet with all kinds of university administrators, think tank people. Everybody always asks us. In fact, the only reason really they meet with us is to say, we have this problem. We need to know how to deal with it and how to get rid of it. What should we do? What would your response be to them?
Wow. Okay. Well, there's different levels, right? So there's people who are captains of their particular association, organization, who have a problem, and then there's the entire society, which that's kind of what I focus mainly on, is what as a society should we do to put this very immiserizing philosophy of woke back in its box. Because what it really represents is a kind of overshooting of things that did some good, actually, liberty, humanitarianism, egalitarianism, up to a point, enhance the flourishing of a society. Beyond the optimum point, they immiserize. And we're in that sort of phase of diminishing returns on the curve. So what should we do about it? Well, what I say, first of all, is we need to get our institutions reflecting democratic public opinion. So the first task is political. Two-thirds of the public, and I've got tons of survey data in the book, Canada, UK, US, across 50 questions, public is about 2-to-1 against woke. And that could be around teaching kids that the United States is racist and built on stolen land. It could be, James Damore's firing, and on a whole range of these questions. The public is just not in favor of the woke agenda. But within institutions, universities, foundations, corporations, government, that agenda is dominant. So the first task then is to use the one institution that the majority can control, which is elected government, to reform the institutions. The elected government needs to go in and say, you're not doing DEI, you're going to have to, you are not signing up to pledges from trans activist groups, from race activist groups. You have the curriculum. We're going to actually design that curriculum so it's balanced. You're not going to just be able to do what you like on curriculum. You won't, and it may be that you ban critical race theory, I think, in schools. I think that actually does make sense, and it's perfectly fine. I don't think you should ban it in universities, where you're dealing with adults who can choose what they want to learn. But I think in schools, absolutely no problem. I think it's probably a good idea, the CRT bans. So this is what I mean. And we've now seen action on, for example, biological males in sports and women's prisons and so on. That too makes a lot of sense. That's got to be done by central government, campaigning on these issues, raising their profile. The only reason you can have male rapists in women's prisons is because the public is ignorant about what's going on. They overwhelmingly oppose this. But as long as that can be slipped under the radar or deflected away by, don't stoke the culture war by paying attention to this thing. So when you, for example, when you allow biological males into women's prison, that's not culture war. When you sort of teach about many genders, or the US is built on stolen land, that's not culture war. If you push back against it, that's you're being a culture warrior, you're being divisive. So that is really where the other side has really got hold of the narrative and the framing, and they can really sort of use this to kind of shut down any scrutiny. So it's really up to the politicians. So if you look at Canada, for example, there's no scrutiny of biological males in women's jails, because the media is essentially all on the left. The political class is entirely scared, or very largely scared. They may be willing to nibble at the edges when it comes to informing parents that their kids have transitioned. Now that's started to become an issue.
Yep. Okay, so let's talk about that. Reed, could you pull up that article? New California law prohibits schools from telling parents their child is trans. Have you heard about this?
Exactly. So they are now, what's interesting about that is, I think they probably hoped they could slip that one by the public, and the papers would run cover for them, and people wouldn't really find out. Because once this stuff hits the headlines and starts to impact politics, it's a huge vote loser for the left. And so their whole strategy is premised on keeping these issues out of the news. The rights, what I argue in the book, this change can only start from the political right. They have to go after these issues, which are majority issues. So they fragment the left electorate, they unite the conservative electorate. They're natural issues. But because of elite norms, and that's very evident here in Britain and certainly in Canada, it's just seen as somehow impolite and not nice to actually campaign on these cultural issues. The left has managed to control the field of discourse and the way the issues are framed to keep these things off the agenda. But they're starting to break onto the agenda, and really the task of right-wing parties is to really get these issues front and center in front of the public as much as possible so that they can't be ignored.
Okay, so let me ask you a question, because I'm trying to figure out this for myself. Pull that article up again, would you please? The new California law prohibits schools from telling parents their children is trans. Okay, so let's say that you have no dog in the fight. Let's say that and one of the things I like about your work is that you're a data guy, right? You have no dog in the fight, and you're not a right-wing guy, you're not a left-wing woman. You're just trying to figure out, like, what's a sensible, rational policy to help govern society. What would the evidence be that you would use for this? Like,
well, I mean, I am probably conservative on these issues, but yeah, I'd say, well, the evidence is, first of all, public opinion. I bet you if you survey the California public, there would be 2-to-1 opposition at least against that. There would be clear majority opposition. So the first thing is to do a survey, then to get it on as a ballot initiative. That's what I would do.
Okay, but you said in that sense, on these issues, I'm conservative. So you must have some kind of principle other than what the majority believes. Because if the majority of people believe this was a great idea, you wouldn't suddenly switch your opinion, right?
Right, exactly.
So yeah. What is the principle by which you're operating here to think that this is bad? I mean, I also think it's insane, but what is the principle that you're operating on that, yeah?
Well, that parents have the greatest stake in their children's upbringing and not the state. Now, I'm not saying that, in every case that's going to be true. You are clearly going to have the odd abusive parent, and in the extreme, their kid may need to be taken away by the state. So, and in the extreme, parents believe insane stuff, and the school can, I think it can certainly, where there is a consensus in society, like not stealing and lying or something, fine, teach that in the schools. Where you have a politically contested view, and in fact a minority view, I don't think it is the place of the school to be indoctrinating and to be pushing one view. The other thing, of course, behind this as well is the transitioning thing. So it's a safeguarding and child protection issue. The trans activists might think we are safeguarding the child by allowing them to transition and experiment with being a different gender. But what if the medical research shows that, in fact, that is a gateway drug to puberty blockers and to gender reassignment surgery, which ultimately ends most of the time in a negative outcome? So actually, you need to safeguard the child. You actually need to really grill them and say, have you really thought about this? And there probably should be a law, you shouldn't be allowed to medicate and undertake surgery before a certain age. So there should be a whole series of safeguards there. And that's kind of what I think is falling away in this particular interpretation, which is privileging the state and the school over parents' rights.
Okay, so now I see why that you frame that as a conservative issue. I try to avoid talking about Marxism, but that does really seem to be like a Marxist issue, and that the state has kind of a dominion over the lives of citizens to the extent that it's an almost ahistorical taking away of the rights of the family.
Well, yeah, I guess, my view in the book is more that this is not necessarily, there's certainly cultural Marxism, which has had an influence, but my argument in the book is a lot of this stems from this more bleeding heart left liberalism. Like, we always want to be nice to the weakest, most oppressed. It's not the sort of cultural Marxist, well, there are structures of oppression, we must overthrow them in a revolution. It's more, no, we want to always be nice and humane to the weakest and most downtrodden members of society. And that's trans. They're more, right. We need to care about them and not the parents. So we always have to go with, and so I guess I wouldn't see this so much as the state. So, for example, a private school, could make exactly the same argument. We don't want to tell the parents. And I suspect they would. These elite private schools are as or more woke than the
Correct.
public
That's
schools.
correct.
Or universities or anywhere that's private would I think push the same philosophy, because it's really a kind of bottom-up emergent, what I call emergent authoritarianism. It kind of, you have influences, you have virality from below. They attack particular institutions. That's where they hit first, are these middle-level institutions, the corporations, the universities, the foundations, museums. I mean, that's where they're attacking first. The state is, they will go for the state if they can get hold of the state. You know, Justin Trudeau's Canada is a good example of that. To some extent, the Biden administration. But I think most of the damage that they're doing is simply under the radar in the institutions, and it doesn't require state power.
Okay. We have some super chats, but I just want to say Reed and I went to Dallas, and I did the most disturbing and important interview. Without question, I had the most insane conversation with this guy who's a whistleblower, Eitan Haim. Have you heard of this?
Yes, yeah, I have. Yeah.
Holy shit. Like, Reed, his jaw was on the floor. He couldn't even pick it up. I was doing my best to keep my composure. But if you really want to hear something about what's actually going on, that interview, yeah, there he is. He was a surgeon, and as bad, Eric, and as corrupt as you think this is, I'm telling you, you have no idea. I mean, this is the most insane shit that you have ever heard. It's so crazy. But anyway,
the point about that is, so the state is now involved because they are, you know, the Biden administration is going after him. But
correct, that is correct.
But almost everything that happened up until that point was only occurring in this institution, for the most part, and associations that deal with this area. And so it's the peer pressure, it's the power of the taboos that the activists leverage. Nobody wants to be accused of being a transphobe or being a kind of Republican. So these taboos and the peer pressure in these organizations is really what's driven this. It's not really been government. I mean, the government's mattered in certain things. So the Dear Colleague, the Title IX stuff, affirmative action, there's certain areas where government's played a role. But in many areas, it's just this ideology this mind virus has captured institutions, has weaponized these taboos, which shut people up.
Yeah, and 100%. And the crisis of cowardice. And dude, they're not only going after this guy, they're going after his wife. They're going after his lawyers. Like, the Biden administration's lackeys are, I mean, again, I don't want to speak for this. I'll let the interview speak for itself. It is another level of, like, it's not even, corruption doesn't even begin to describe what this is. And all of these people are fucking cowards. They sit there in institution after institution. But the thing that's been pissing me off lately is when people, you know, do start to criticize this, there's a kind of pompous self-assuredness of them. Like, oh, now, okay, well, where were you 10 years ago when criticizing the derangement syndrome was actually difficult? But I would really recommend that interview. Okay, we have some super chats. Let's do this. Let's go to the top one. Read. Oh, Vital, $10. If you think voting for Trump is a step toward classical liberalism, you're wrong. Comment?
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment. Yeah.
Well, it's probably a mixed picture, isn't it? I mean, to the extent that he tackles DEI, and maybe with Vance in position, they'll be serious about. See, a lot of this is about getting into the policy detail, into the legal detail. So if they can get DEI out of the federal government, if they can get critical race, if they can somehow influence that from being in the schools through some kind of tied funding to the extent they can federally, that will advance classical liberal principles of merit and equal treatment and objective truth and free speech. So in that sense, Trump could very much advance classical liberalism. Yes. Now, if he is threatening, you know, I suppose to the extent that he enables, criticizes the liberal democratic system and undermines legitimacy for it, then he might threaten classical liberalism. I guess it all depends what you think he's going to do.
Yeah.
And so to the extent he gets after DEI and critical race theory and stuff, I think he is advancing classical liberal principles. But we'll see. We'll see.
Yep. We'll see. And it's funny that we both are speaking about this like it's a done deal. And the fact that Biden doesn't step aside is so crazy to me. The Democrats are just in shambles. They're not even in shambles. They're just a disgrace. They don't even rise to the level of disappointment at this stage. All right, let's do K. So as we know, Eric is from a continent, although he lives on an island now. He's from Canada. This pronoun issue is already in Canadian schools, and I'm sure you've heard about this. Gad has spoken about this. Jordan has spoken about this. Oh, Gad also's new book is about suicidal empathy, which is what you talked about. I love I just love the wedding of those two words. So yeah, it's in Canada, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, but that's actually correct. Okay, let's do a super chat here. Holy moly. I don't even know how to
well, this is kind of what we were talking about a little bit, this whole issue of
let's read it.
Oh yeah,
let's read this first. 10 bucks. Evidence for hereditarianism is overwhelming. See Warner 2021. What does Kaufmann think of Nathan Korfis's thesis that widespread elite belief in hereditarianism would end wokeness? I would love to answer that when you're finished.
Well, you might like to know that tomorrow night in London, I'm going to be debating Nathan on this very question. So not to let the cat out of the bag, but
don't say too much then.
No. Actually, I don't mind actually, but one of the arguments is that if it is hardwired and genetic that there are intelligence differences, and that's what accounts for the wealth gap, for example. I mean, if that were true, then the only position the only thing that would end, because a key component of woke is this idea of equal outcomes for historically marginalized groups.
Correct.
And so race gaps,
equity.
gender must be equity, right? So in a way, if there is a hardwired IQ gap between races, then there's no way you could ever get equity. And the only way you could ever come to terms with it is to essentially go with Nathan Kaufmann and other hereditarians who argue there is this gap and we have to actually accept it. Now, I guess I'm still of the view that because the polygenic studies haven't been done, it's just twin studies, and there are still potentials there methodologically for there to be some slippage there that, essentially there is also this question of McWhorter and Lowry and Coleman Hughes and others, who would argue that this is about family structure and education, motivation, all these sorts of things, savings.
Well, that's
and to the until we actually are able to test out that cultural, so what I would say is, in a way, it's possible to attack woke on the cultural side, even if you don't go towards the genetic side. So I don't think it is necessarily the case you must take the hereditarian genetic route in order to knock down the woke argument. Because, I mean, if you just say, look, this is a matter of intact families and culture. Now, that could be wrong, but it is certainly
it's not wrong. It's not wrong. It's absolutely not wrong. I mean, we know that the one stat I love talking about was the presence of an adult male in the home as a criminogenic factor, lack of an adult male in the home, and that tends to be more common among African Americans, for example. But you can certainly mitigate if it's the case, and I know that the left, the identitarian left, doesn't even want to give the argument any countenance. But if it is the case that there are genetic issues, then many of those issues can be mediated, or even I think mediated is the right word in that sense, by cultural concerns. But many, like Kendi and D'Angelo and others, particularly Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates, they won't even consider the cultural argument, which is, again, as I said, is just that's completely insane to me. Like,
because I mean, I suppose the argument is, if it is actually culture, I mean, it could be culture, it could be genetics, but let's say it is culture, then the solution has to be some kind of a cultural revival.
Well, that's correct.
And so it's not necessarily the case that one has to go the hereditarian route.
Okay, so let me. I don't want the podcast to go down this rabbit hole, but I do want to ask you the question that, if the moment that you admit that there is that there are some groups that score higher on IQ tests, for example, like Ashkenazi Jews, followed by Sephardic Jews, followed by cold climate West Coast Asians. The moment you start admitting that, then by definition, that means you can't have a higher unless you have a lower.
Yeah. Yeah, but the same question would be: are the Jews scoring higher because they've had, or the Asians, because the Asians had this long book learning to pass the Chinese civil service exam way back when, or the because of organized irrigation for rice or whatever. I mean, so there's a question around: is this simply cultural, or is it genetic? And again, I don't think whether groups are high or low on this resolves the question. The only thing that'll resolve it is the genetic research, which I think if the West doesn't allow, I think the Chinese and others will.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. And it's always seemed to me to be very unusual, to say the least, that the people, I think I just said this in the show recently, that the people who think that there are no differences in intelligence among the races, quote unquote races, those people wouldn't be screaming for the rooftops about advancing genetic tests. Because if you actually believe that, you would be, I mean, that would be your raison d'etre. I mean, you would really be out there clamoring, freaking out, screaming from the highest rooftop that we need to do these tests as soon as possible so that we could eliminate this. So I think that these people actually believe it.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, we got a must tweet. Pull up that must tweet. This is really
always entertaining. Yeah.
His feed is fantastic. They're taking Biden fishing soon. God, his feed is so he's just doesn't give a shit. Like he just
no.
And all of the tech guys, the tech lords, so shall we say, have come out in support of Trump, which I found very interesting. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, I mean,
it
is a sort of a shift. I mean, Biden, I think, as it's been explained, he's always been super ambitious politically. Always felt that he was somewhat of an outsider to the Ivy League types, the Clinton, Obama types, and so I think his whole life has been about this. To give that up is almost to give up your sole reason for existence.
But he got it. He already got it. Yeah. Oh yeah. Let's blow that up fully, Reed, so everybody can see that. So I want to take a look at these names. So this is super interesting to me. Ben Horowitz, Bill Ackerman. I can barely read these. Elon Musk. I mean, the list just goes on. Andreessen is a multi-billionaire. Yeah. Like the list just goes. Joe Lonsdale, who's had 3 unicorns from the University of Peter Thiel, Trevor, Tyler. Yeah, I mean, look at that list. Holy shit! Like that is a who's who of tech billionaires, and they're all enduring. David Sachs, I don't think he was on there. Oh, that's his tweet. Yeah. And then people will tell me privately things like, "Oh, I never in a million years, like I couldn't fathom ever voting for Trump, but now there's just no question." And yet yet Biden does not step aside. Like it's so.
Now, yeah, but it's worth saying something, which is that it's not as though they have a bench full of home run hitters with high popularity ratings. There's nothing like an Obama sitting on the bench. It's a bunch of people who poll basically they poll the same as Biden or worse in most cases. So it's not, it makes it an easier decision for him to sort of just not move, because it's not obvious who would replace him and who would necessarily do better.
But if you know that you're going to lose and you love the country and you genuinely think this guy's a threat to democracy or whatever he is, you just find him an odious human being or his policies or both, then why wouldn't you step aside?
Because you have a big ego and your whole life has been about this and
okay, but then yeah, I mean, and then look at the moron of Harris. She's a total moron, like a complete idiot. And it is amazing to me, like she is clearly a DEI perspective and a DEI hire. And I just think that the chickens are coming home to roost.
Sorry, Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
No. I mean, I think this question of why the quality is so low, on the Democratic side is. I mean, this is a question. I think if they had somebody good, the pressure from, the Democratic Party could be enough to push him out. Maybe. I mean, I know that legally there's a big debate over whether those delegates are pledged to him, whether they could even technically, if he doesn't want to let go of those delegates at the convention, can they push him off? It's not even clear what the legal precedent is for that.
Yeah. All right, let's go back to your book again. Pull up the title. What else from your book should people know or be aware of?
Well, one of the things I talk about in the book, okay, there's the political strategy. The right has to lead this. And so I've talked about that. The state has to reform institutions, really work on the school curriculum is central, because the other point I make is that one of the reasons I'm very pessimistic about the decline of woke is that young people are just vastly more woke than older people. So 2/3 of under 25s in Britain and the US think James Damore should have been fired for questioning the internal memo on gender in their or in the organization, compared to a quarter to a third of older people. In Britain, people under 25, it's like 50-50 over whether J.K. Rowling should be dropped by her publisher. Almost nobody over 45 believes that. So in time after time, we're seeing this generation is really a lot more woke. And in 20 years, when they're the median voter and the median captain of industry and so on, I just worry that the culture is going to shift away from a lot of taken for granted assumptions about free speech and
I wouldn't worry about it one iota. I worry about it zero.
You think that they will change their views?
No, I think the whole society will collapse way before then. It's the views that they have that will bring about the death of the meritocracy. It's the views that they have that will bring about their own death and destruction. I worry about it not at all. I think it's poetry.
Well, okay. I guess that's, that doesn't sound like a great outcome to me, but you might be right. The other thing I would worry about.
It's not a great outcome, but that's what they're going to get. They're going to find what they seek. They're going to get exactly what they want. And I mean, I'm going to be dead. I don't give a shit, but right. I did all, I'm going down swinging.
But for those, maybe for those who, like me, who have this longer time horizon, I suppose I would, the other thing I would say is I think the right needs to come up with a moral argument against the so-called be kind philosophy, which has dominated for so long. I mean, and one of the arguments I talk about in terms of a post-woke vision, when it was during the Cold War, which the sort of freedom side won, it was about, well, if we make everybody have exactly the same, then we're going to demotivate people. We're not going to get creativity. We'll get economic stagnation and collapse. And I think similarly, we have to take that argument into the culture and say, if we are going to insist on equity, the equal number of different minority groups in a Shakespeare play and equal numbers in the history books people read, and everything's got to be equal, then we're going to have immiserization in the culture. Just as when you go for equity,
but that's what they want. They don't want sovereignty. They want the culture to be immiserated. And I'm telling you that we have to. People in a democracy, people have to be held accountable, and so they will be held accountable as they bring about the demise and collapse of the society. I mean, there's no way about it.
Well, they believe, they will have you believe that DEI is contributing to strength, like diversity is our strength, right? Their view is that this is making the culture better. And I suppose we need to be able to say, no, actually, that is a net loss to human flourishing. You are immiserizing, you are impoverishing our culture. And so we want not just, we're going to think about equality and diversity, but we want those things to be optimized. Those are not absolute goods. So we have to get away from the kind of what I call cultural socialism, which is the view that equity and diversity are absolutes. We have to push them to the max all the time. I think we can say we can have some of that stuff, but it's got to be less than it is now. There is a natural level of inequality.
Why would we need any of it?
Well, I think, obviously, if you can imagine if there was an old boys network of, white male Harvard, this doesn't exist, but if at one time there was this old boys network, they only hired their own, then yes, we would need to introduce some sort of, metrics around equality to be able to say, well, everybody being hired here is a white Harvard male, so we need to kind of, open it up. Now, what I would say is you can open it up in the sense of, you could have wider recruitment. You could recruit at state universities, and you could recruit more broadly. So your pipeline looks more equitable, but then you still choose on merit. That would be an example of where there's we're going to do a bit of equality. That's going to help. But if you go too far on that then leads to a sacrifice of freedom, truth-seeking, social cohesion, beauty, merit, excellence, all these other things which you have to sacrifice in order to make a maximal, to maximize society towards the goals of equity and diversity. And so, I think we need that more well-rounded morality to push back on their morality.
I wonder if people are going to look at this conversation in even 10 years and think to themselves, boy, these two guys, they had no idea of the advances in AI, of the vast unemployment of the laptop class, I wonder if there are going to be sweeping technological innovations that are going to make, like, that they would think that we're thinking about the wrong things, that they would think that we're concerned about the wrong things.
Well, I guess to the extent AI helps us move to be a less labor-hungry society, we may not require the kind of immigration levels.
That's what I was thinking.
So that could be one thing. The other thing, of course, is the genetic enhancement side of things, which, if you're talking about intelligence, then that's going to impact on that. And it's really an open question how, there are people who say that this is going to be with us sooner than we think, because the Chinese will get a hold of it and other people will start doing it. No choice. I don't know if that's true, but I think if that happens, then that's another game changer.
Yeah, Boster makes that argument in Superintelligence. All right, so let me ask you a question. So I've been asking guests this lately, and I've been fascinated by their response. I hope you haven't heard their response, and I'll give you my response. So what do you think is the number one problem facing the United States today?
The number one problem, boy. God, that's a tough one. I can't actually say, ultimately, I think for the world, the collapse in birth rates is got to be seen as one of the leading problems. Now, that affects the U.S.
We have to talk about that. Okay, go ahead.
That affects the U.S. a bit less than other places, but it still affects the U.S. And I think, I don't know, until we're able to get a hold of this and find some solution for it, and it's been since 1970 that we've had below replacement birth rates in the West, or certainly in Europe. The U.S., it's only happened more recently. But there seems to be no bottom to this thing. It's just falling. And nobody has any idea of how we're going to get to 2.1 children per woman, which is what we need. And so,
Boy, I could not possibly disagree with you more on that. Like, I think that's a good thing that we're decreasing and shrinking the population. I think there are way too many people.
Well, I sort of partly agree with you. I'm sort of in between. So I don't think, I wouldn't have a problem with the population decreasing a certain amount, but not an enormous amount. I think I would like to know where the bottom is and that we have a plan.
What do you think? What about 1 billion? What about 1 billion people? I think 1 billion is more than enough people. In fact, way more than we need. Look, let me just very briefly lay out some cursory arguments to you.
Yeah.
More people is more strain on infrastructure. More people is more ecological issues. More people makes it more difficult to solve problems, more like geopolitical problems. I just don't see. I just think that this must be. I'm trying to say this in a way that is the least offensive way possible, and I'm thinking, well, why am I even bothering with that? I think I've given up on that long ago. But I think that this is a kind of a mimetic idea that people have that I just don't think there's any evidence for. What is the evidence that we need? What is the evidence for any of this stuff?
Well, it's very difficult to argue about, is more population going to have benefits? I'm not in favor of more, actually. I'm in favor of kind of maintaining. I'm very much a conservative in the sense of I'm attached to places as they are in a way, and the society we've established. Because once you have population decline, then whole villages and towns are going to shut down and be vacant, and ghost towns, and you're going to have all kinds of there is a problem economically in terms of economic growth. Even on a per capita level, there are those who would argue that it's very hard to get savings and investment when you have shrinkage. The other part of this too is you cannot have population decline without changing the balance, the composition of the population in different countries.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
Because the thing is, there are populations that are going to always have high fertility. And it's not necessarily the developing world, which is kind of moving in the direction of falling fertility. But I did a book in 2010 called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? People who are strongly religious, particularly world-denying religious sects, they have very high fertility and often retain the children in the fold. You just have to look at the Hasidic Jews, the Amish, and other groups. And so are they the people that are going to inherit our societies, and what kind of society is that going to be? It's not enough just to say, well, we're going to relieve crowding. And wouldn't that be nice if everybody had and of course, services will be impacted if you don't have the population density to keep everything clean and take the garbage out. And, so you do need a certain number of people. And so I guess I would aim for maintaining our current level of population. And I don't see how
the fecundity of those groups is interesting. Mormons in particular, and then previously Catholics. Hey, let's jump into a super chat. Trader Bear, friend of the show, for $10. Woke is never going away passively. One battle won is nothing. No, there will have to be a war against the ideology. The middle has to stand up, and someone has to show them the way. Thoughts?
Well, yeah,
the middle here, the middle.
Yeah. So, there are people like Greg Lukianoff and Yasha Monk and some of the IDW who think, no, we've got to persuade. We can't use state power. I'm very much, no, I'm with a sort of Chris Rufo, Richard Hanania. We need to use the state to reform the institutions. And in fact, it's state pressure. For example, if you look at Claudine Gay and Liz McGill and the hearings, those were instigated by the Republican Party. The anti-CRT, anti-DEI legislation in red states, that is why, in the context, of course, of October 7th and the pro-Palestinian stuff, but that is why all of a sudden you have Harvard and MIT backtracking. They didn't backtrack because their faculty wanted them to backtrack or the students wanted them to backtrack. They're backtracking because of external pressure, which is driven ultimately by the right. So this has to come from the right. And and even if you're a center leftist who's anti-woke, I try and persuade them, look, you need to be able to say to your far leftist activists, we have to do this or we're going to get killed in the election. And so James Carville, who is anti-woke, but he's in the Democrats, can say, if we persist in pushing these policies, if we do nothing about trans and class, then we are going to lose elections. And so we have got to, and you see that a bit in Britain. The Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer, the newly elected leader, has backtracked. He now says, a woman is an adult human female, and he now says, no, we're not going to have gender-affirming care and so on. And that's because he's under pressure from the conservative media and the right, which has essentially set the tone. So, yeah, I would agree we need political proactive measures.
So, wow, there's so much there. There is so much there. There's, the kind of the flash in the past, the whole IDW, Yasha Monk versus the Chris Rufo angle. And I'm also thinking about that other question, that other super chat we got about if you think voting for Trump, you're voting for classical liberalism, you're wrong. Are you optimistic about the state of the United States now or not?
I am maybe I'm more optimistic than some in that I think, if I compare, the U.S. is definitely in the lead when it comes to anti-woke legislation and political activity, mobilization at school board level, media campaigning. They are definitely in the lead. Whereas you might say Britain was in the lead, certainly on the gender issue. I think the U.S. is maybe starting to slowly get there on gender, and it's in the lead on critical race and DEI. So I'm not as pessimistic as you are. I think it'll be interesting to see if Trump gets in. It'll be interesting to see what happens on that front.
I'm only pessimistic because I didn't tell you the number one issue that concerns me for the United States, and it's the debt. That's why I'm pessimistic.
Right, but I think with debt, if you can't, I kind of think that I'm less pessimistic in the sense that I think that will just lead to belt tightening, because you can't just keep borrowing money. The U.S. can probably
think.
Well, the U.S. can do
I
it.
wish someone had told us that before.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a degree to which these things can be cyclical. Now, the U.S. can do it because they can borrow cheaply. They have the reserve currency and everything like that. But and in a way, if the borrowing costs start to rise and crowd out other public spending, I think you'll get a Ross Perot style pressure to trim that back, and there will be cuts. I'm not
Yeah,
as fearful. I don't think it'll run away. I just don't think, because the electorate won't pay tax. The ratings agencies will downrank government debt. I just think there are inbuilt checks economically.
Yeah, I've been reading about what austerity would entail, and I'm telling you, it's not looking pretty. Are you bearish or bullish on the UK?
I mean, I'm a bit bearish for the next 5 years. I guess I'm somewhat more bearish because the young population here is extremely woke. The Labour Party's in; they may be in for 2 cycles. The woke is getting more entrenched in institutions, and some of the government legislation will put that on steroids. And so I would say that the pendulum is swinging the wrong direction here. I mean, on the gender issue, I think they've done well, and I think that's under control. But I think on anything to do with race and history, the immigration picture is a very difficult one, and I think that will be much higher immigration rates than the U.S. Although the illegal immigration is much higher in the United States, and I think probably if the Republicans get in, they'll control the border in a way the British Tories didn't handle immigration.
What do you make of this? What do you make of this image?
You're going to see more of it. I mean, the Muslim share, according to Pew, which is a centrist organization, the Pew projections. So Britain's 2021 census showed 6.5% Muslim. The 2050 projections have it at about 17%. So that's a 2.5 times increase over the current number. Already in this last election, we had a number of independent Muslim candidates, essentially, damaging the Labour Party. So there's already a Muslim vote, and that's making its power felt in elections in this country. You run that clock forward to 2050. I think when you're talking about 2 or 3 times the share, in certain cities, that's going to be, we're getting towards, possibly majority Muslim. Yeah, I think this is what happens. I think when it is simply too difficult to have these kinds of conversations. Now, of course,
exactly. I couldn't agree more. 100%. I mean, I just couldn't agree more. So I'm going to, at the risk of offending you, I'm going to ask you a question. I asked Carl Benjamin this question.
Yeah.
And I know it's going to sound facetious, but I'm not being facetious at all. At some point, don't you think you have to have a meaningful conversation about surrender?
Well, if what you're saying is surrendering your culture to Islam, which I believe,
your sovereignty and your culture, and you have to, within those negotiated conditions, you have to say, but just please don't murder us all, and we're willing to have we will be subjects of the caliphate. You have to make some kind of a deal at some point.
Well, I think well before that. I mean, the first thing to say is we're not going to reach 50%, Muslim, even by the end of the century. But
I don't think you need 50 for the surrender.
Right. I mean, I think, however, these questions are going to be a lot more live in 20 years, even in 10 years, because my argument is, in a way, it's fine to have a certain proportion Muslim minority. The share in Britain is fine. I mean, in some areas it's not fine, but generally speaking,
Whitechapel,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But I think this is all a question of numbers. Like you can tolerate even intolerant groups at low levels because they have no power to enforce their will on anybody else. When the numbers get large, then you do have a problem. And so I think this is where I think we need to get to the point to say, well, we have to be able to have a conversation about cultural composition and about where we want that cultural composition. We're not going back to 1950, but I think we can have a say in how quickly we change. What is the rate of assimilation? So there is a certain degree to which certain Muslim groups do assimilate and actually,
very much so,
and in fact will become non-religious. And so I'm thinking in France of the Algerians and to some degree the Moroccans. There's a reasonable outmarriage rate. There's a reasonable secularization rate. Okay, but in Britain, the South Asian Muslims extremely low in both counts, and so if it's extremely low like that and there's low assimilation, I think you are justified in limiting the immigration. I think you've got to balance immigration with assimilation. If you don't have assimilation, you can't have the immigration. I mean, that would be my view.
Right. So real quick, we only have 5 minutes left. So how did your debate at Unheard go with Helen Pluckrose?
Yeah, I think quite well. I mean, I think I was trying to probe where our differences were because obviously we're both kind of anti-woke, but she's more of a classical, hands-off classical liberal who doesn't necessarily want to use the state. She's more on the Yasha Monk, Greg Lukianoff wing, whereas I was saying actually it is perfectly legitimate within a liberal order to use the state to clamp down on illiberalism. So if a university enacts speech codes and violates the free speech rights of its staff and students, when the government says you can't do that, they're actually furthering liberty. Similarly, when a school indoctrinates students in DEI propaganda, in critical race and gender ideology, and students feel that they can't express themselves, they don't have freedom of conscience, it is perfectly in keeping with classical liberalism to say you're not indoctrinating. If you do, you're going to be fired or punished.
Yeah.
And that is actually, you're clamping down on institutional autonomy to improve individual autonomy. So this is where I differed from Helen.
Okay, and Reed, pull up that image one more time, please. So you were there with Helen, and the Unheard facility is fantastic. It's great. The restaurant is great. Florence Reed there's Helen doing what Helen does. She's called a machine gunner. And then there's Florence Reed, and then there you are. Okay, good. And where are you going to be debating tomorrow?
Well, apparently it's some secret location, so I don't even know.
Oh, really? Because
I don't know what. I guess they don't want to attract attention. Maybe because it's the whole race question, but it's crazy because we're not actually, But it's kind of interesting because I suspect what'll come out is, you've got these two strands on the right now. One is the more tech libertarian right, which I think is more comfortable with this genetics and hereditarianism, and then the other is more the cultural conservative, national populist type right, which is maybe more believes that people have identities, they're attached to them. That's understandable in a way. So it's not a good idea to go attacking people's identities. So I suppose but it'll be an interesting debate, I think.
But yeah, I mean, it's disturbing to me that it would have to be held in silence and secret anyway. I mean, already that shows me you're losing something. You've lost. Not you've lost the debate, but the society, the culture has lost something. I remember when I was there a few years ago, I saw a sign on the tube that said something like, the wording isn't exact, but the sentiment is important. If you know somebody who's about to, blow a bomb up or commit mass murder, report it to the authorities. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, you need a sign for that? You need to tell people that in a sign? Like, that's a public service announcement that people can't figure out if someone wants to commit mass murder, that they need to. And I'm like, wow, that you're lost at that point.
Well, I don't know whether they provided a phone number you could, something that, so if people were already thinking that they didn't know where to turn, maybe then it may.
Yeah.
I can't remember these signs. Did it not have a number to call? Or
it did, but it should have been something like, if you know anybody who's, it should have been more descriptive or something. All right, one more, last one, quick, and then you've been generous with your time, Eric. Trader Bear, $10. I think the Achilles heel for woke is K through 12 education, energizing parents with exactly what is going on and having them overwhelm schools, districts with the threat of removing their kids. An idea. Here's my thought on that. If people knew, if the general public knew what the people who traffic in the ideology actually believe, they would be mortified. Like, the problem is that it's just so crazy that nobody believes that they believe it. Like, if it were a little less crazy, people would be like, holy shit, we need to get this out. We need to just like go on a jihad against this. But it's just literally so insane that people will say to you, well, no one actually believes that. Like, they don't actually, nobody, like, you guys are just some like, and then they're always trying to paint you, of course, the other problem, they're always trying to paint you as being on the right. Like, you're some right-wing guy. Well, no, I don't know how many times and how many different ways I can say it. Just because you oppose an idea because you don't think there's sufficient evidence to warrant belief in it, or that the confidence in the justification of the belief, like equity, has been extended way beyond the warrant of the evidence, it's clearly ideological. That doesn't make you on the right, right? In the same way that being against phrenology, if the right or the left had it, doesn't make you. I mean, it's just like, but that you would have to explain that to people shows that there's some kind of an educational morass.
Yeah, I mean, it's very tough for people to understand this stuff a lot of the time. So one of the things I find in the book is that when you have a clear image, like a tattooed rapist going into a women's prison, then suddenly the public's with you. You need these clear images. The image says 1,000 words. I did an experiment. We showed this teacher, this trans teacher that had size 9 prosthetic breasts. I don't know if you saw that picture from a Canadian school. You show that, and it flips. The people say, "Oh no, they absolutely shouldn't be teaching." But if it's just described, then some of them are okay with it. And then that also gets to another point, which is really that when it comes to this, the last question, what do we do about this? School choice. Schools are the central, absolutely the key issue. I think school choice is actually not going to solve this, because most of the teachers are coming from the same places. The materials are the same.
I agree.
So too many conservatives think, oh, we'll just open it up to school choice. Well, it's like universities. You've got school choice on universities. That's not going to solve the problem at all.
And
it won't deal with indoctrination.
I couldn't agree more. And I keep screaming about that. No one's listening. You have to change the way the teachers are certified. I'm hoping that University of Austin is going to do that, and other new institutions that are coming up. You have to change the process so that they're using the best evidence-based, non-ideological curriculum and pedagogy. And for me to say that does not, that does not make me a conservative, people. That doesn't make me a liberal either. It just makes me a guy who believes that we should formulate our beliefs on the basis of the best available evidence. I mean, it's just, it's crazy.
But even if you are, for a very smart parent who can go to a classical school and avoid critical race and gender theory, I mean, that's great for them. But when 95% of the kids are being pushed through the mill of the mainstream system, getting indoctrinated, your society is going down. So it's not enough to have choice for yourself. You got to worry about the 90% going through the system. So you got to reform the system.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, Eric, great friend of the show, a great guy. I love your work, love the stuff you're doing. Where can people find you?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, you can find me on the internet. I'm at www.sneps.net, on Twitter at EPKAUFM. Also, check out my book, The Third Awokening, or if you're in Britain, it's entitled Taboo. They've just come out. Get a copy. And I've also got a course on woke, which is an open online course that anyone can take. And if you just, that's at the University of Buckingham, actually. So if you Google that, you should be able to find that too.
Excellent. Good for them for having that course, right? That's pretty ballsy. That's pretty good.
They're trying to be the University of Austin for the UK, although they have a long way to go in terms of having the same outlook, but the leadership is excellent.
Oh, good for you. And again, thank you so much, Eric, for being on the show and being a friend of the show. And I love the work you're doing. And just keep your browser open for a minute and read. Thanks again for what you do. And thanks to all the people who support the show. And we very much appreciate you. We can't do what we do without your support. So thanks.
Thanks, Peter. It's been a pleasure.
Right on, Eric. Thank you for watching. Everything we do is under the umbrella of the National Progress Alliance, nationalprogressalliance.org. It's a nonprofit, independent 501c3. Your generous donations keep us going and keep fueling content like this. So please help us out. Make a donation. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.